my name is Soghoian, and I am a privacy researcher. In particular, I study the surveillance state that we now live in. Not exactly the theme that's happened today. All right, so if you look in Hollywood movies, cop shows on TV, we see a single vision of surveillance. We see surveillance as a labor-intensive task for the police. Right? So imagine a police officer climbing a telephone pole to attach a couple wires to be able to intercept a particular phone line. Or the image of an FBI agent hunched over a pair of headphones in an unmarked van parked outside someone's home, listening to the conversations that are occurring inside. And certainly that did happen a few years back, but that's not the way that modern surveillance works. Modern surveillance, for the most part, now occurs in the comfort of an air-conditioned room, at a comfy desk, a nice chair, and the surveillance itself is performed with a few keystrokes, someone typing away at a keyboard. Whose fingers are behind the keyboard? It's not the police. In fact, it's employees working for the companies to whom we entrust our private data. Search engines, social networking sites, and telephone companies whose products we keep in our pockets at all times. These companies have teams that do nothing but respond to government surveillance requests. Sprint, the third largest telephone company in the United States, has more than 110 employees who do nothing but respond to surveillance requests. Facebook has 25 employees. So the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in 2007 said that electronic surveillance depends in great part on the cooperation of the private companies that operate the nation's telecommunications system. Our modern surveillance state would not be possible without the willing assistance of these companies. We are spied on because they help. Now, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals noted just a few years ago that technological progress poses a threat to privacy by enabling an extent of surveillance that in earlier times would have been prohibitively expensive. What does this mean? 10, 15 years ago, if the FBI had wanted to tail someone, had to watch where they're going 24 hours a day, they would have needed a team of 10, 15, 20 agents, right? The person is driving around in their car. You need a few vehicles with a few agents in each one, tailing the suspect. Every few minutes, the vehicles have to change so that when you're looking in the rearview mirror, you don't notice the same vehicle following you at all times. 24-hour surveillance requires 24-hour surveillance teams. That's a lot of agents. Those are a lot of salaries. And the FBI has limited resources. And so in the days of scarce surveillance resources, the government had to figure out who was a high priority for surveillance. That is no longer the case. Modern surveillance is cheaper and more efficient. And why not? Technology companies make everything more efficient and everything cheaper. Now, today, a police officer from the comfort of his desk can monitor 200 or 300 individuals' location in real time with services provided by the communications companies. Sprint, for example, offers a website where law enforcement can log in and pay $30 a month for unlimited access to an individual's real-time GPS location information. In 2009, Sprint revealed that in the 1 year since the website had been set up, it had been used 8 million times. So Verizon, a large telephone company, one of the largest ones in the country, they revealed in 2007 that they get 80,000 requests a year from law enforcement agencies. But most companies actually don't provide any data. Verizon wrote this in a letter to Congress. Google is probably the most transparent company in the industry, and for that we should thank Google. So when you get home to your computers, look for Google's Transparency Report. It's a website that they've set up that provides aggregate, detailed information, breaking down surveillance requests every 6 months, showing how many they get from different law enforcement, or from law enforcement in different countries, which requests they turn down, which requests they approve. So Google's great, and so we know from this that they get about 12,000 requests a year in the United States. But most companies don't provide this level of data, or in fact, any data at all. And because of this, most surveillance occurs below the radar. We simply have no idea how much is occurring, although experts estimate that there are at least a few 100,000 requests a year made in the United States. All right, so one thing you really need to understand is that the way US law is written, companies cannot refuse to comply with a surveillance request. If the request is valid, if it's a valid court order or it's a valid subpoena, companies must give your data to the government. There's nothing they can do. Now, some companies lean more towards protecting users' privacy, and some companies lean more towards providing loyal assistance to the government. But all companies must hand your data over to the government. When the request comes in, the data goes out. But companies do have flexibility in other areas, right? So they have to respond to the requests, but the kinds of data they keep and the other things that they do are things that they control. And so some companies, in fact, have very different practices with regard to the way in which they protect your privacy or don't protect your privacy. Now, unfortunately, you won't find this out by visiting the company's websites. There are big differences between the telephone companies. There are big differences between the search engines, between the email services and social networks, and they don't compete on their privacy practices. Now, one of the best ways that companies can protect their users is through transparency. Right? So while companies are obligated to give your data to the government when the government asks, they have the freedom to tell you about many of the requests that they get. Not all companies tell users. In fact, the norm in the industry is to not tell users about requests for their data. Twitter and Google, in this regard, are actually unique. Both companies have established policies that whenever possible, whenever they're permitted to do so by law, they will tell their users about requests, oftentimes before they hand the data over to the government, thus giving the user the opportunity to hire a lawyer and try and contest the order if they think that maybe it isn't appropriate. Most companies don't have these policies, and for this, we should thank Google and thank Twitter, because they really are doing something that is not required of them by law. In January of 2011, the media reported that Twitter had received a request for information about 3 individuals associated with the WikiLeaks organization. Now, for those of us who study surveillance and are interested in this topic, the fact that Twitter is receiving requests isn't news. This company receives hundreds, if not thousands, of requests a year from law enforcement agencies around the world. What was interesting here is that the request was sealed. The judge who had issued the order to Twitter had sealed it, which meant that Twitter was prohibited from telling the users about the request. In this case, Twitter hired very expensive outside counsel and got the lawyers to ask the government to unseal the order. The lawyers made a convincing case, the order was unsealed by the judge, and then Twitter was free to tell the 3 WikiLeaks-associated individuals. Those people themselves hired lawyers, tried to fight the request, and that matter is ongoing. In October of 2011, we also learned that Google and a small California ISP named Sonic, a provider of broadband service, had also received requests, court orders, as part of the same investigation. Now, the details are a little bit unclear, but it seems like Google also asked the government to unseal the order, but in Google's case, they were not able to convince the government or the judge, and so that order remains sealed. In fact, the only reason we know about these orders is because of anonymous sources who provided information to the Wall Street Journal. So, most companies do not tell users about government requests for their users' data. They could, but they choose to not do so. I think some would think that it might alarm users, it might give consumers a reason to not trust the companies with their data, and after all, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we shouldn't trust these companies if there's nothing they can do to stop our data from ending up in the government's hands. And so in this regard, Google and Twitter are transparency leaders. They are going beyond the call of duty. They're doing far more than is required of them by law. But even in these cases, the government still gets the data. Even though Google can tell you about the requests they receive, they're still forced to hand the data over after they tell you. In the case of the WikiLeaks order and Twitter, the individual's information eventually made it into the hands of the Department of Justice. No number of lawyers could shield the data from the government's fingers. Now, there are ways to protect users. There are more comprehensive ways to protect users. And the most comprehensive, the best way to protect users is to not keep the data in the first place. Companies that do not keep data have nothing to hand over when the government comes asking for it later. But most companies keep user data. Most companies keep huge amounts of user data. In fact, the trend in Silicon Valley is to keep as much data as possible, right, just in case you can figure out how to monetize it later. So Google keeps detailed records of who you are and what you're searching for and where you're searching from, and they keep that information for 18 months at a bare minimum. And then they modify some portions of it and then keep the remaining bits for much greater periods of time. Bing, which is Microsoft's search engine, they keep that same data for at least 6 months. Twitter keeps records of where you're tweeting from for a period of up to 18 months. Now, the company is a little bit vague with their actual data retention period. I think it's a few months, but in their privacy policy, they say it's up to 18 months. And Facebook is entirely vague about what they keep. Probably they keep it for a significant period of time. But these companies keep our private data that will eventually make its way into the government's hands. Why? Because the dominant business model in Silicon Valley is to provide free services to consumers in exchange for their personal and private information. Right? These companies give us fantastic social networking services, free email, web browsers, and other software, and in exchange, they collect our data and they monetize it. Right? They have these black boxes, whether it's behavioral advertising, whether it's detailed dossiers on individual consumers, whether it's analytics. The dominant model in Silicon Valley is user data goes in, profits go out. This is the norm. Most big companies have adopted this, and many startups think this is the way forward. But these business models, at their very core, are fundamentally incompatible with strong privacy protections from the government. If you keep data for purposes of data mining and analytics, there's nothing you can do to stop when the government comes and asks for it later. And so companies have to choose. They have to choose privacy or the business model. Now, Google has made this choice. And does this mean that Google's evil? Google has chosen keeping and monetizing and mining user data over privacy. Now, I don't think this makes Google evil. But I do think we have to acknowledge that they've made a conscious choice and that their business model won out. This isn't the only business model, though. Other business models can protect user privacy. So this is a photo of a street in my town in Washington, D.C. This is just a few blocks away from me. And this is a storefront run by a phone company called Cricket. Cricket is a prepaid provider of telephone service that targets largely urban markets. They target people who don't have credit histories, who just want telephone service without any surprises. I don't work for Cricket, and the reason I'm even mentioning them is that the American Civil Liberties Union just got 5,000 pages of documents back from a Freedom of Information Act request, actually several requests, detailing the surveillance practices of many firms. And Cricket provided, or the information about Cricket was really eye-opening. So Cricket keeps no records about the numbers that you dial or the numbers of people who call you. Cricket keeps no information about the text messages that you send, or at least the contents of the text messages that you send. And Cricket keeps no records of the IP addresses given to you that would detail what you do online and allow others to link your activities on the web to your mobile phone. Cricket keeps the bare minimum necessary to provide you with telephone service. Now, this is not the norm. The norm in the telephone industry is to keep lots and lots of data. So as an example, AT&T keeps records of who you call and who calls you for between 5 and 7 years. Many telephone companies also keep detailed records of where you've been, historical location information about the towers that your phone's connected to for periods of several years. Right? And so the norm in the telephone industry is to keep data, but they don't need to. In fact, when you pay for a service with money, that company doesn't need to go and find other ways to pay their bills. Right? When you pay $50 a month or $100 a month, that service doesn't need to engage in data mining. They don't need to engage in analytics. Their bills are paid. They can pay their employees. They can return a profit to their shareholders. The monthly bill that you pay them enables them to protect your privacy if they wish to do so. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that paying for a service automatically leads to privacy protections. After all, AT&T famously illegally shared its customers' information with the National Security Agency as part of the warrantless wiretapping program. Many phone companies are truly in bed with the government. And so just because you pay a monthly telephone bill doesn't mean you get privacy protections. But paying for a service can enable a company to protect your privacy if they wish to do so. With free services, the ad-supported services, the data mining-supported services, there will always, at the end of the day, be a clash between privacy and the business model. And privacy never wins. If we want privacy from these companies, we have to start paying for it. Thank you very much.